The stench was unbearable. Even heavy tapestries, soaked in incense and braziers with crushed resin, could not hide the foul odor emanating from the queen's chambers. Those who dared to enter held linen handkerchiefs soaked in vinegar and tried not to look at her legs, which were swollen and covered with festering cracks. At the head of the bed, chained to short iron chains, sat two eunuchs, silent, with downcast eyes. She said they were guarding her innocence, although it had long been whispered in the palace that these men were the last witnesses to her madness. She could still speak, but her voice was hoarse, as if a tight rope had been pulled across her throat. In the mornings, she was bled, in the hope of relieving the fever, but the blood flowed thick, dark, almost black, and the doctors grimaced, glancing at each other. The senior physician, who had served at the court for many years, wrote in his journal that her pulse is weak and uneven, her fever is high, her urine is cloudy and smells bad, her tongue is dry and cracked, and her mind wavers between prayer and blasphemy. According to the custom of the time, in addition to decoctions of roots and ointments made from lard, bags of warm ashes were applied to her body, and her skin was rubbed with a mixture of vinegar and crushed garlic. It was believed that this drove away putrid vapors. All this only intensified the smell that permeated the walls. Political life at court during those weeks was secretive but turbulent. The heavy curtain separating her bedchamber from the reception room became the boundary beyond which the fate of the throne was decided. The old families, who supported strict rituals and the power of the church, argued with the young courtiers, who were drawn to a new order where the word of a merchant was as valuable as a title. The queen's declining health signaled the beginning of the struggle. Ambassadors from neighboring lands delayed their departure, advisors whispered, and the eunuchs she kept at her feet heard everything but remained silent. Servants later recounted that she often cried out at night, accusing invisible enemies of pulling at her veins and drinking her breath in the darkness. One of the young doctors claimed that she had developed festering ulcers on her thighs, and that when she was turned over, she screamed in pain, and the skin in those areas was loose and detached from the flesh. But access to the bedroom was strictly limited. Only two doctors, two eunuchs, and the senior lady-in-waiting who hardly ever left her bedside. The guards were changed twice a day, and each time the guard was changed, the guards inspected the iron chains at the eunuch's feet, not for fear of escape, but to make sure they were still there. According to a palace report compiled for the council, she had not left her bedroom in the last 3 weeks, and her food was limited to soft bread, boiled meat, and wine with honey. But at times, she refused to eat and drank only water, demanding that she be cleansed from within, and ordering that her body be sprinkled with holy water until her skin began to peel from the cold. The archpriest, who was invited to read prayers, once noted in his letter that her eyes wander and her hands, thin and trembling, frantically search for something under the blanket, as if she were looking for the chain to which she is tied. Doctors did not dare to name the cause of the illness, but in private conversations they spoke of internal decay, blood poisoning, and possibly womb dryness. The people whispered that she was being punished for her sins, for allegedly ordering the drowning of her son's concubine in a pond, and for executing a monk who had accused her of witchcraft in her youth. Superstitious old women at the market insisted that the eunuchs in chains were not guardians of her chastity, but victims whose silent suffering was meant to ward off death. from their mistress. In the evenings, when the candles burned down, and only the dim light of the braziers remained in the chambers, she asked her lady-in-waiting to bring the eunuch's chains closer to her, took them in her hands, and said smoothly, without trembling, "As long as they are here, the enemy will not enter." One of the eunuchs, who dared to speak after her death, claimed that during these moments the queen quietly repeated words of prayer, but distorted them so strangely that their meaning became incomprehensible. Her breathing became heavier, the swelling rose above her knees, and according to the doctor's notes, in one night, the skin on her shins burst in 3 places, releasing a thick yellow-brown liquid. The next morning, the wounds were cleansed with wine, after which her cries could be heard in the neighboring gallery. Despite the obvious signs of bodily decay, she continued to insist on receiving foreign ambassadors and twice ordered them to be brought into her bedroom, where she sat under a canopy, her legs covered and her face thickly powdered. One of the ambassadors, upon returning to his country, wrote in his report, "I saw the sovereign, but it seemed to me that she was already half in the power of the grave." The first signs of inner madness began to manifest themselves in sudden changes in behavior. In the morning, she could affectionately bless her courtiers, and by evening, she would scream that they all wanted to poison her. This created fertile ground for intrigue. Some courtiers added fuel to the fire, while others tried to hide her condition. But rumors spread. Whenever she lost consciousness, doctors and her senior lady-in-waiting closed the doors, and armed guards stood at the entrance. Reports compiled by secret scribes for the outer council stated that her mind is wavering, her body is decaying, and the court is waiting for the outcome. Meanwhile, in the neighboring chambers, sealed chests containing documents, seals, and jewels were being prepared in case of her sudden death. Several times during those weeks, attempts were made to hold secret meetings of the heirs, but the guards, placed there on her orders, dispersed the gathering. It was a time when the smell of death had already entered the walls, and the queen herself was still clinging to life, holding on to it as tightly as she held the chains of her silent guards. By the end of the 4th week of illness, it became clear that the former queen could not be saved. Her face, once white and smooth, was covered with dark, almost black spots, as if blood had stagnated under her skin. Her eyelids were swollen, her eyes looked cloudy, like those of a person who had not slept for many days, and at times her pupils dilated so much that the iris disappeared. The doctors explained this as thinning of the brain juices and tried to treat her with opium decoctions mixed with honey, but to no avail. Her mind would clear, then plunge into dark, speechless fits. At such moments, she would lie motionless for hours, not answering questions, and then suddenly start screaming, demanding that the one who came from the darkness be let in. The servants on duty at the doors later reported that these words were repeated at night, and each time the eunuchs in chains tensed their arms as if preparing to restrain someone invisible. The medical procedures became more severe. Bloodletting was now performed twice a day, at dawn and after sunset. The blood flowed slowly, in dark clots, and sometimes the doctors were forced to cut deeper than custom allowed in order to release the evil spirit. After each session, she was covered with furs to prevent her from shivering. A warm mixture of lard, onion juice, and crushed juniper was rubbed into the wounds on her legs. It was believed that this would stop the decomposition. In reality, the smell only intensified, And according to the recollections of one young doctor, the flesh, which was decomposing while still alive, no longer responded to touch. Intrigue intensified in the palace. Seeing that the queen's health was rapidly deteriorating, the old nobility tried to persuade her to appoint a new heir, bypassing her nephew, a supporter of the reformers. Secret messages began to find their way into her chambers, sewn into the folds of her ladies-in-waiting's dresses or hidden in bread baskets. But the guards, acting on her orders, searched everything, even her personal prayer books. Several people were arrested right in the corridor and taken to the dungeons. At the same time, rumors spread throughout the city that the queen's illness was punishment for sins of the flesh, and that the eunuchs chained to the walls were living sacrifices whom she had condemned to death to atone for her sins before the heavenly court. In the markets, women whispered that they had seen large buckets of foul-smelling liquid being carried out of the palace at night, and that the water in the wells near the walls had become cloudy. Priests began to argue openly among themselves about whether she should undergo a special purification ritual. Supporters of strict rituals demanded that she be confessed publicly in the presence of the council in order to wash away the shame from the throne. But the court protopope, fearing a political scandal, postponed this, citing the extreme weakness of her body. One night, when the doctors had left to prepare new potions, a lady-in-waiting noticed that the queen was sitting on her bed, holding in the chain of one of the eunuchs in her hands and whispering something in his ear. The eunuch did not move, but tears were streaming down his cheeks. That morning, he began to suffer stomach pains, and by evening, he was dead. On the queen's orders, his body was not removed from the chambers until the following night, so that his spirit might still protect her. The guards' report for that day noted the smell became so strong that the guard had to be doubled, for the relievers refused to go inside. To suppress the stench, resin and dried herbs were thrown into the braziers, but the smell of human decay still penetrated the incense and smoke. By the end of the month, she began to have convulsions. At first they were short, with only her hands shaking, but then they became severe, with her face contorting and her losing consciousness. After one such attack, she came to and, recognizing only her senior lady-in-waiting, said, "Don't let them remove the chains, or it will all be over." These words quickly spread throughout the court and became fodder for rumors. Some claimed that the chains were holding her soul in her body. Others, that they were a symbol of a pact with the devil. During the same period, doctors discovered deep ulcers on her back caused by prolonged lying down. Pus mixed with blood soaked the sheets, and the guards who carried them wore gloves, although this was not customary. Her body no longer belonged to her. It had become a slowly decaying burden, held together only by stubborn will and fear of death. At that time, secret meetings were taking place in the neighboring halls between two rival groups of nobles. Some planned to immediately convene the council and transfer power to the heir, while others demanded to wait for a natural outcome, fearing accusations of usurpation. Each side had its spies in the palace, and each sought to be the first to know when the queen would breathe her last. One of the secret reports intercepted by the guards read, "She is already dead. Only her eyes are still wandering. Her heart beats with fear, not strength." So the days passed in a stifling mixture of stench, whispers, oaths, and bribed doctors. And although it was clear to everyone that the end was near, she herself continued to cling to life, clutching the cold iron links as if they held the key to her salvation. By the beginning of the 6th week of her illness, it became clear that the Queen's power was based not on her decisions, but on the fear she still knew how to instill. She could no longer lie down. The swelling and decay of the lower half of her body made any movement unbearable. She was seated on a throne placed directly in her bedroom, under a canopy, and propped up with pillows so that she could speak. But her voice had become so hoarse and husky that one had to lean close to hear her words. Doctors noted that her breathing had become irregular, with longer intervals between breaths. An examination of her abdomen revealed swelling and painful hardness. They suspected internal decay, a condition in which the intestines are affected by decomposition and do not remove toxins. As a result, the skin on her hands and face took on a yellowish-green hue, and the smell became so strong that it could be smelled even in the neighboring gallery. Doctors increasingly resorted to opium-based potions to numb the pain and convulsions, but under the influence of these concoctions, her consciousness became unstable. She would whisper prayers, then suddenly begin accusing those present of treason. At times, she ordered the eunuchs in chains to keep their eyes on the doors, claiming that assassins were trying to sneak in at night. On her orders, the guards were reinforced, and the corridors near her chambers were lit all night long so that there would be no shadows. Inside the palace, an open struggle was already raging. A group of old boyars and 2 influential military leaders gathered a secret council in one of the empty halls to discuss the possibility of arresting the heir while the Queen was still alive, in order to deprive him of support. Upon learning of this, the heir's supporters intercepted 2 messengers with letters and publicly accused the old nobility of treason. The scandal grew so intense that the noise reached the Queen's chambers, and she demanded that both commanders be brought to her. She was carried on hands into the small audience chamber. She sat motionless, wrapped in furs, and only her eyes, dull and sunken, followed every word. It was said that the smell from her body was so strong that both voivodes involuntarily turned away, but she noticed this and ordered them to sit closer. Then, in a barely audible voice, she said, "As long as I breathe, no one will take my throne." After these words, one of the commanders lost consciousness, either from the stench or from horror. The next day, the second eunuch died. Doctors claimed that death was caused by exhaustion and blood poisoning. Deep ulcers from iron shackles were found on his hands. His body was also left in the chambers overnight, and the Queen demanded that the chain not be removed so that his spirit may continue to serve. The servants said that in the morning she was found asleep with her hands on the cold corpse, as if it were a talisman. The death of the second eunuch intensified the fear in the palace. No one hid the whispers about the curse anymore. People began to leave their service, using illness or family matters as an excuse. In the kitchens, they refused to cook meat for her, claiming that she doesn't eat it anyway, and the smell is so bad that it's impossible to breathe. Meanwhile, her body continued to decay. Doctors described how the tissue on her legs had become so soft that when bandages were changed, they stuck to the skin and tore away from the wounds along with the flesh. Boiling water and salt were used to disinfect the wounds, but this caused wild screams that could be heard in the distant corridors. At the same time, the heir began to act openly. He stationed his guards near the chambers forbidding entry without his personal permission under the pretext of protecting the sovereign from ill wishes. The senior lady-in-waiting tried to challenge this order, but she was forcibly removed and sent to a convent. This was the first time in her entire reign that anyone had dared to remove someone so close to her. At night, 2 days after the lady-in-waiting's expulsion, the Queen, according to the doctor, fell into a delirium and tried to get up, clutching the bed. She repeated, "They want to remove the chains, and then it will all be over." The doctor and the guards held her down by force, and she remained in this position until morning. A note intercepted by the guards during those days read, "Her body no longer obeys her, and her mind is clinging to the chains. When they are removed, she will be no more." The court was plunged into anticipation. Some prayed for her quick death, others hoped she would outlive her enemies, and still others sought ways to sell their services to either side for profit. But it was clear to everyone, the agony had already begun. By the end of the 8th week, the disease had turned her body into a motionless, decaying skeleton. She could no longer sit up. Every touch of the pillow against her back caused pus to burst from her bed sores. She was laid on a special bed with boards covered with stretched cloth to allow air to touch her skin and slow down the decay. But the stench became so bad that the doctors tied handkerchiefs over their faces and rubbed mint oil on their nostrils when they entered. Her breathing was rapid and ragged, with wheezing sounds like water gurgling in a vessel. Her stomach swelled to the size of a pregnant woman's, the skin stretched and darkened. The doctors knew that pus was accumulating inside, but they did not dare to open it. Such a procedure almost always ended in death on the same day. Her face was swollen, her mouth did not close properly, and dark saliva with the smell of rotten meat constantly accumulated in the corners of her lips. Her mind was fading. Sometimes she recognized people, asked to have the Psalms read to her, held a cross in her hand, and kissed icons. But more and more often, she fell into delirium, talking to dead eunuchs, claiming that they were standing at the foot of her bed as before, only now their chains are made of light. These words made the servants tremble, and some refused to stand guard at night. External control of the palace finally passed to the heir. He moved his residence to a neighboring hall and placed a triple guard at the Queen's chambers. All letters and reports now went through him. Only 2 doctors, the archpriest, and 1 trusted servant appointed by the heir himself, were allowed access to the sick woman. The old boyars, who had lost their influence, hurried to transfer their lands and titles in exchange for safety after her death. Meanwhile, rumors in the city took on a sinister character. It was said that the Queen's illness was not decay, but the living consumption of the body from within, that worms lived inside her, feeding on her flesh. Others claimed that every time one of her close associates died, she seemed to grow stronger, and that the death of the eunuchs was no accident. To strengthen his position, the heir ordered the public execution of 3 people accused of attempting to set fire to the palace chapel. The execution took place in the square in front of the palace. The crowd shouted, demanding that the throne be cleansed of filth. And although the Queen's name was not mentioned, everyone understood who the cry was directed against. Meanwhile, in her chambers, the painful procedures continued. The doctors now pierced her swollen legs, draining fluid from them to reduce the swelling. The fluid had a sharp, putrid odor, and after each procedure, all her linen had to be changed. Opium was administered almost constantly, but it no longer relieved the pain, only plunging her into a semi-conscious state, where she moaned and whispered that the chains are getting shorter. On the night of the 9th week, she began to bleed heavily from her mouth. The doctors tried to stop it by cauterizing her palate with a hot iron, but this only caused her to scream, which, according to eyewitnesses, pierced the entire building. After that, she could no longer speak, only opening her mouth and gasping for air. The guard's report for that day stated, "The stench is so bad that the doors to the chambers had to be left open, but no one dares to come closer than 3 steps. She lies motionless, her eyes open, but she sees no one." During those same days, the heir began to secretly distribute positions among his supporters. Some nobles, who had recently sworn allegiance to the Queen, themselves asked to be accepted into the new circle of power. And the people waited for only one thing: when the bells would ring, announcing the death of their ruler. It was clear that the end was near. Even the doctors stopped making notes about her treatment, limiting themselves to brief notes. Condition unchanged. Strength failing. On the night of the 10th week, her breathing became irregular, with long pauses after which her chest rose sharply as if she were being pulled from the depths. The doctors understood that the agony had begun. According to the custom of the time, wax candles were lit at the head of the bed, an icon was placed there, and prayers for the departure of the soul were read. The priest on duty noted in his notebook, "Her eyes are wide open, her gaze is fixed, her lips are dry, her body is cold below the chest." At midnight, she suddenly regained consciousness and, without taking her eyes off the empty corner of the room, whispered, "The chains have been removed. It's all over." After these words, her face relaxed, her head turned slightly to one side, and her breathing stopped. The doctor put his ear to her chest, then signaled to the guards. At that moment, the guards changed watch at the door, and the heir entered the chambers with 2 of his associates. They stood silently while the doctors covered the body with a blanket, then ordered that all the chests be sealed immediately and the personal papers removed. The old servants were led out and were never seen again in the palace. Due to the strong smell, the Queen's body was immediately prepared for embalming. The procedure proved almost impossible. When the abdomen was opened, pus and putrid fluid spurted out, and one of the assistants lost consciousness. The doctors, covering their faces, sewed up the cavity with rags soaked in resin and honey. But after a few hours, the fabric began to darken. To preserve the appearance of her body, it was thickly rubbed with a mixture of wax and bleach, and her face was covered with a thick layer of powder to hide the stains. Despite the rush, the smell spread throughout the palace. When the coffin was carried into the chapel, the guards could barely keep from vomiting. The people gathered at the gates could not see the body. The coffin was closed, and it was announced that such is the custom for great sovereigns. But among the townspeople, there were already rumors that she had been hidden because her face had turned black and swollen, like that of a drowned woman. The political consequences were immediate. At dawn, the council gathered in the throne room and proclaimed the heir as the new ruler. He promised to cleanse the court of corruption and restore order. On the same day, arrests began of the Queen's former associates, especially those who supported the old nobility. Several people were publicly executed, accused of abusing the trust of the sovereigns. The old boyars, deprived of their influence, tried to flee to neighboring lands, but were detained at the borders. Riots broke out in the city. A crowd ransacked the house of one of the councillors, known for his closeness to the Queen. The proto-pope, who had once defended her, left the capital and went to a monastery. Foreign ambassadors, observing the events, wrote in their reports to their capitals that the throne passed into new hands without a battle, but with blood on the threshold. One of them added, "The fear she inspired during her lifetime has now turned to hatred after her death." The funeral was quick. The coffin was placed in the burial vault, but without any fancy ceremonies. Only her name and years of reign were carved on the slab. No pictures, no inscriptions about her achievements. It was as if they wanted to erase her reign from memory. Later, in one of the medical treatises, a doctor who served at her court described her illness as the decay of the body while the soul is still alive, when the internal juices poison the blood and the mind fades away from the fear of death. He also mentioned the chains of the eunuchs, calling them a symbol of her last defense and madness. Thus ended the life of the Queen, who kept her guards in chains, convinced that their torment preserved her innocence. Her death brought new power, but also a new era in which fear of the old order was replaced by a thirst for change, and the memory of her remained only in whispers and the stench that had permeated the palace walls.